forged down flat into pancakes that kind of look like this, and then those get broken up into smaller pieces, and you can see how that's been stacked on. And so you just keep doing that over and over again. Once you get a bar that is reasonable, you cut it in half, stack it back onto itself, and you just keep doing it over and over again. Because here you can see there's a lot of stuff in here that is not metal. There is charcoal and slag and all sorts of stuff in there that you don't want. And the only way to get that out is to flatten it, heat it back up again, and forge it back onto itself over and over again. And every time you hit it with a hammer, you burn stuff out and you squeeze stuff out. So anyway, that starts with a clay furnace. That furnace there was made from just local clay, sand, and straw. It's all mixed up. It's real similar to if you've ever made a pizza oven or a wood oven. It's the same kind of clay that you would make. And basically the way that works is you have a cylinder and you fill it up with charcoal, and you have an air source coming through the bottom, and you take your iron ore and you break it up into little pieces and you sprinkle it on top. And as it descends through the stack, everything that's not iron melts. Most of what you have in something like this is, even though it's really heavy and dense, it's still mostly not iron. It's mostly what you'd consider glass almost, silica and slag, and it all turns into molten lava in the bottom, and then the iron finds itself down there and it accumulates into what you call bloom. So all the conditions have to be exactly right for that iron to find itself down there, and it takes a lot of experimenting. Yeah.
What's the melting point of iron?
Well, that is close to over 3,000 degrees, but you never actually achieve those temperatures in something like this. This is what's nice about it. This is when I realized, well, this is something a person can do, because you're not melting metal at all in this case. All you're doing is melting everything that's not metal. Now, it turns out a lot of what I do does involve melting metal. It turns out that you can achieve 3,000 degrees really easy with just a hairdryer, and I'll show you how I do that back around the corner. A lot of the steel I make now is based on a later process where, anyone see Secrets of the Viking Sword, the PBS show?
Yeah, we saw it.
Did you? Okay, well that guy is the guy I learned steel making from, and he has a theory that Viking swords were made, the metal was made somewhere else in Persia, and then it came up through trade routes into the Viking world, and I don't believe that at all. There's a group of us that believe a whole different theory, and I'll show you. I'll talk about a little bit of that over around the back of the shop. But well, let me talk about copper real quick. Copper is something I've recently gotten into. Does anyone know about copper from our region and how important it is and interesting?
Kinda.
My dad's a copper hound.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I tell you, once you learn about it, I mean, if you're like me, it's like an addiction. But we live in one of the few places in the entire world where copper occurs naturally as a metal in the ground. Iron, there's one weird place up in the Arctic where you can actually chisel metallic iron out of rocks, but iron has to be smelted from ores. Copper usually does too, but there are very interesting conditions. In fact, if you've never been up into the UP of Michigan to look for rocks, it's something you should learn about, because there are so many amazing things going on in that region. It makes it really unique in the entire world. It's when you go up into the UP, especially under the Keweenaw Peninsula, you're walking directly on the crust of the earth. I mean, you're as far back in time as you can imagine when you're standing on this rock. And you have right at your fingertips things that are buried in hundreds of feet of soil anywhere else in the world. It's really incredible when you start to learn about the rocks in that area. But copper is one of the things that occurs there as a metal, and this is a piece that came out of the mines. I mean, this has never been smelted or melted or anything. It just formed that way through hot water seeping up through the rocks and the cracks. This is the first piece my son and I found. My son's 6 years old, and we were looking with metal detectors at an old copper mine, And what I was doing was picking up signals, and he'd pick up things on the ground and wave it in front of the metal detector. And this, when we found it, looked like a rock. So you can't tell it when you find it unless you have a metal detector. So this is a piece that would have formed up in the cracks or in the fissure of a rock, and then it eventually got broken up by glaciers and separated out. So it's pure copper, and it's really amazing.
What'd you do to clean it up?
A little bit of just a little bit of acid. I didn't want to. I was careful because I didn't want to eliminate the actual mother rock. I wanted it to look like it came from the ground. And then I have sort of a Scotch-Brite belt that I polished it up with. The color that it's taken, it was as bright as any copper you've ever seen, except it has a slightly darker color. But the patina that it's taking is just through handling, and it forms a much different patina than regular copper, and that's because there's stuff like arsenic and pure silver in it. There's a bowl that I have on display at a gallery in Ironwood right now, and when I was making that bowl and forging it, you could see silver running out of it into the bottom of my forge. It left little worm trails as it melted away. People have known about this copper for thousands of years. 4,000 to 6,000 years ago, people were making tools. We didn't have obsidian and flint and everything you needed here to make stone tools, so they made copper tools. These people learned, jutting up out of the ground, you could find veins of pure copper, and they would build big fires on top of those rocks, so and then pour water on them so the rocks would shatter, and then they would take the bits of copper and forge them into things. And these are real, a little spear point and a knife, and they're made directly from the ground without any smelting.
Is a copper knife like actually do something, or is it?
Yeah, it
soft?
is. And the thing about copper that makes it usable as a tool is it's really soft, right? But if you hammer it, the more you hammer it, the harder it gets. And then when you heat, it's the opposite of iron. And with iron or steel, you have to heat it up and then quench it in water to harden it. With copper, you heat it up and then you quench it in water to soften it. But then as you start to hammer it, it gets harder and harder. If anyone's ever worked with copper wire, it feels really soft at first, and it starts to get kind of hard, and then it just breaks. That's because it's just through bending that copper, you're work hardening it. The molecular structure of the copper is changing inside and getting harder and harder. So what you do is you forge this, and you got to heat it up and hammer it, and you just do it over and over again. And then the last thing you do is hammer it on an anvil until it's almost paper thin, so that you're hammering it down to a sharp edge. There's almost no sharpening or using, you can use a light sharpening stone, but if you do that too much, you'll eat through the hard part and get back into soft stuff. So yeah, it's a pretty effective tool. I've made my own copper knives, and they work around the house for cutting rope, cutting things. They have to be sharpened more often, but they're also very easy to sharpen. So, it's just one of those things it's not as good as modern steel, but it's better than anything else that they had, and it was way better than anything else they had at the time.
Yeah.
So,
Wow.
and when you learn to forge copper after you forge steel, it is amazing. It's just, it moves like butter, and it does whatever you tell it to do. Whereas some of this iron can be extremely stubborn. It'll just, especially stuff that you make yourself, will just start to fall apart and crumble, and it's very frustrating to make this stuff and get it to the point where you can make a blade out of it. In fact, I take things like flint and obsidian, and I'll shatter them because you get such a sharp edge, and I'll use them for wood scrapers. But they work great for that. But if you try to use them as an axe, they're always chipping them.
So actually, is this sword made of obsidian, and it's really deadly?
No, it's actually not even really sharp because, for one thing, these types of swords weren't really that sharp on the edges because they're made mostly for thrusting.
But in movies, I saw swords like those swords being really sharp.
Yeah, usually the point is sharp, and sometimes they were sharp on the edge. What makes this interesting is that you can do this without breaking it, and that is the hard part. If this sword was fully hardened, when I make a blade like this and you quench it in water, if I took that out of the water and tried to do that, it would snap about right there. So what I was just talking about, the tempering that you do after you harden a blade allows you to do something like that. I mean, it's pretty amazing. You know, this is again what makes steel. No matter what, anything else that you try, nothing can do something like this and still have an edge that's hard enough. And that's why I stick it in the forge and I get it hot, and then I hit it with a hammer to shape it. I use hand hammers for some things. I have to have a power hammer for some things. I also have a hydraulic press, which I just broke, so I can't iron that. But so people always, you know, when you talk about traditional metalworking and I do traditional work, that's an anvil. I'll tell you guys all about that in just a second. You know, if you're making medieval swords, everyone wants to know, are you doing it all by hand, or are you doing it like the people did? Well, one thing people forget is a medieval smith, a Viking smith, there was a master smith that had who knows how many guys working for him, and these guys all had sledgehammers working for him. And I've done this before. I've worked with a group of guys that were very good with sledgehammers, and when you have that working, everyone takes turns hitting the metal. You can move steel really fast. But I work by myself and I can't afford to hire these people. So I have to have power equipment to make up for that. So power hammer. The press is nice because that's a 30-ton press and it's slow, but I can squash metal that's this thick. I can work with steel that thick with that thing.
Is this the water what you dip in?
Yeah, I have to have oils and waters for cooling things off really fast. So anyway, I usually have to do my fine finishing hammering by hand. You know, when I forge a piece, I want it to come out as clean as possible. One of the things you learn, which you can apply this to all aspects of life, is if there's something you can do now, do it now. Don't put it off till later and expect something else to fix it. You can do it. I can use a grinder to fix a mistake I made during forging, but it's better to forge something nice and clean, as pretty as possible, and it's going to save you a lot of work later. So there's a lot of things I've had to teach myself when I got into this, and that's slow down, be patient, and treat every step of the process like it's the most important thing in the world. When you teach something, when you start to treat things like that, then eventually you can make beautiful things. So apply that to everything in life. Slow down, take care at every step. I wasn't doing that a few years ago. You always want to rush to the finish line. Okay, so you guys, let's step out here, and then I'll show you probably about 300 or more layers in there, because every time I make something like this, I cut it into half or into thirds, and I stack it back onto it. So every time you do that, you increase the number of layers that are in it, and the more layers it has, the higher quality it's going to be.
Yeah.
So you're off school today,
So this traditional steel like that has to be worked at a far higher temperature than what you would normally do, because there's still a lot of slag and things in there that cause problems. If you try to work it at a lower temperature, it will lead to the whole thing just cracking. So you got to work at very high, at temperatures that would almost ruin normal steel.